My son has a best friend named Marcus. They've been inseparable for 32 years. Same birthday parties, same fishing trips, best man at each other's weddings. Thomas always said, Marcus is the brother I never had. Last April, I found out he was right. And I found out that Marcus had known that for 11 years and never said a word, not to Thomas, not to me. He was waiting. He wanted me to find him first. My name is Walter James Briggs, 80 years old, Macon, Georgia. Same house since 1987. I have one son, Thomas, 53 years old. Good man. Better man than me in most of the ways that count. And I have a dog named Earl, who is the most loyal creature I have ever known, which tells you something about the rest of the company I've kept. But to tell you this story right, I have to go back. Not to 1972 when Thomas was born. Further, to 1968. I was 23 years old, living in Atlanta, Georgia, working at a shipping warehouse on the south side. One-bedroom apartment on Vine Street that smelled like old carpet and the cigarettes of whoever lived there before me. I owned a 1965 Ford pickup that overheated in traffic and a record player that worked when it felt like it. And I was married, not to Diane. Her name was Cecelia Ann Watkins. I don't say her name out loud very often, not because I don't think about her. I do, more than I probably should, but because saying it still costs me something. Even now, even after 55 years. She was 21 when we married. She laughed too loud and spent money we didn't have on things we didn't need, and she burned everything she ever tried to cook. She was the most alive person I had ever been in a room with. We married in June of 1968. Small ceremony. Her mother, my cousin Raymond, a pastor who mispronounced both our names. In September of 1969, our son was born. We named him David. David Earl Briggs. He had Cecilia's eyes, wide and dark and slightly suspicious of everything, like he'd arrived in the world already knowing it couldn't be trusted. He was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and 14 months later, I left. I am not going to dress this up. I left. Cecelia and I had been fighting for most of those 14 months. About money, about her mother who had moved in after her father died and made it clear in quiet ways that she never thought I was good enough. None of that is an excuse. I know that. I knew it then, which is why I've never tried to make it into one. I was 25 years old and I was scared, and I had a son I didn't know how to be a father to, and a marriage that felt like a room that kept getting smaller. December of 1970. I packed 2 bags. I told Cecelia I needed some time, that I'd be back. I was not back. I sent money for a while. The last check I mailed was in March of 1972, $40. I remember the amount because I stood at the post office on Forsyth Street and I looked at it for a long time before I put it in the envelope. $40. For a son I had abandoned. I mailed it and I walked back to my truck and I drove home and I never sent another one. A month later, Thomas was born. And I told Diane I had never been married before. I told her I had no children. I looked her in the eye and I said those words, and she believed me because she had no reason not to. She died in 2014 without ever knowing the truth. That is the second thing I will carry to my grave. I thought about David. I want you to know that. I am not going to stand here and tell you I forgot about him or moved on cleanly and never looked back. I thought about him. On his birthday, September 14th, I always knew what day it was. I'd wake up and the date would be sitting right there at the front of my mind before I was even fully conscious. I just didn't do anything about it. That's worse, maybe. Knowing and not doing. Remembering a birthday and letting it pass like weather. By the time Thomas was born in 1972, David would have been 2 years old, walking, starting to become a person. I have no idea what that looked like. I found out through my cousin Raymond around 1978 that Cecelia had remarried, a man named Clifton Graves, that he had adopted David, that they had moved to Birmingham. Clifton Graves stepped into a space I abandoned and filled it completely. without condition, without needing me to be the villain so he could be the hero. He just showed up and stayed. I told myself David had a father now, a real one. I told myself the story in the way that let me sleep at night, and then I buried it. For 30 years I buried it so deep I almost believed it had never happened. Thomas grew up, did well, Georgia State, accounting, and somewhere in his sophomore year, 1991, he met a guy in his dormitory named Marcus Graves. Marcus Graves. I met Marcus for the first time at Thanksgiving of 1991. Thomas brought him home because Marcus's family was in Birmingham, and the drive wasn't worth it for a 4-day break. He was 19 years old, tall, easy smile, and something about his eyes, wide and dark and slightly watchful, like he'd arrived in the world already knowing it couldn't be trusted. I shook his hand and thought, I like this kid. I had no idea. I had absolutely no idea. The years went the way years go when you're not paying attention to the right things. Marcus became part of the furniture of our lives. Thanksgiving, Christmas when his family couldn't make it, Thomas's wedding in 1998, Marcus in a gray suit at his side, steady as a wall. Marcus married in 2003. He invited me to the wedding. His wife's name was Diane. I remember thinking, when Thomas told me, what a strange coincidence. Her name was Diane. I smiled at the wedding, shook her hand, told Marcus he'd done well for himself. It wasn't a coincidence. He had known exactly what her name meant. He knew. I didn't. My granddaughter bought me the DNA test. Christmas 2023. I opened the results on a Wednesday morning in March. Earl at my feet, coffee going cold, under close family matches, 2 names, Thomas Allen Briggs, my son, 50%, exactly where he should be, and below him, Marcus Darnell Graves, 25%. I stared at that name, Marcus Darnell Graves, Thomas's best friend of 32 years, 25%, half-sibling range. I put the laptop down. I walked to the kitchen window. Earl followed and sat on my foot. And then very slowly, like a door opening in a dark room I had kept locked for 50 years, it came together. Marcus Graves, Birmingham, Cecelia, the boy born September 14th, 1969, the boy whose stepfather's last name was Graves, David Earl Briggs, who became David Graves, who became Marcus Darnell Graves, who had been sitting at my Thanksgiving table for 32 years. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not a chair, the floor. Earl kept licking my hand. The coffee was completely cold by the time I got up. I thought about every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every fishing trip, Marcus standing beside Thomas in that gray suit in 1998, and his wife named Diane. He had named her after my wife. He knew who I was, he had always known, and he had sat at my table anyway, year after year after year, waiting. I called Thomas, didn't tell him what I'd found, just asked, casually, like it was nothing, whether he'd heard from Marcus lately. Thomas said they'd had dinner the previous week. Why? I said no reason, just thinking about him. I sat with what I knew for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of waking at 3 in the morning and lying in the dark going over every interaction I'd ever had with Marcus, every conversation at my dinner table, every time he'd looked at me in that quiet way I had always read as simple affection. Had it been affection? Or had it been a man looking at his biological father and measuring the distance? Measuring whether the distance was his fault or mine. I thought about what it costs a person to know something for 11 years and say nothing. To sit across from your own father at Christmas dinner and pass him the bread and ask him how his knee was doing and never say the thing you came there to say. What do you have to believe about a person to do that? What do you have to be afraid of? I found his number in Thomas's old phone directory, stared at it for 3 days. On a Tuesday night in April at 9:15, I called it. He answered on the second ring. Mr. Briggs, he said. Not hello. Not who is this. Mr. Briggs. Like he had been expecting this call. Like he had been expecting it for a very long time and had simply been patient enough to let it arrive on my schedule instead of his. We met the following Saturday, a diner on Forsyth Street in Atlanta. I got there 20 minutes early, sat in a corner booth, ordered coffee, watched the door. He walked in at exactly 10 o'clock, 54 years old, tall. That same easy walk I'd watched for 3 decades at my own dinner table without understanding what I was looking at. He sat down across from me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, "You knew?" Not a question. He nodded. He said he'd found out 11 years ago. Genealogy research. Just curious about his biological father's side. He'd found the records. Found my name. Walter James Briggs, Atlanta, Georgia, 1968. He'd found Thomas through me. And he'd realized that the man he'd been looking for was his best friend's father. Someone he already knew, had already known for 21 years. I said, "Why didn't you say anything?" He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "Because I wanted to see if you'd come to me. My mother told me about you before she died. She didn't tell me everything. She was kind about it, kinder than you deserved. But she told me enough. She told me you left. She told me you built another life. She told me you had a son you loved and a wife you loved, and you never once looked back at what you'd left behind." He kept his voice level, calm. The voice of a man who had rehearsed this not out of anger, but out of the need to say it exactly right when the moment finally came. I needed to know if that was still true. If I was right there in front of you, year after year, your table, your house, your son's life, I needed to know if you were still capable of not seeing me. He looked down at the coffee cup between his hands. You were. 2 words, quiet as a verdict. 32 years, Mr. Briggs. I was right there. I didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like an excuse. He looked back up at me. But then you called, and that's the only reason we're sitting here. I watched you love Thomas his whole life. I watched you show up for him. I saw what kind of father you became. His voice dropped slightly. You just aimed it at the wrong son. I told him I was sorry, not the way you say it in a hallway. The way a man speaks when he finally stands inside the full weight of something he did 50 years ago and has spent every year since then refusing to look at directly. I told him there was no explanation that made it right. I told him his mother deserved better and he deserved better, and I had been a coward at 25 and a coward every year after that when I had the chance to find him and chose the comfort of not knowing instead. He listened. He didn't forgive me on the spot. He didn't tell me it was okay. He said, "I know." And then, "I still came back to your table every year." I said, "I know. I'm still trying to understand why." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I needed to know the love you gave Thomas was real. That it wasn't just luck he got that version of you. I needed proof you were actually capable of it." He looked at me steadily. "You were. You just aimed it wrong." We sat in silence for a while after that. The coffee went cold between us, and that was enough. I told Thomas 2 weeks later. That was the hardest conversation of my life, not because of the anger, though there was anger, but because of the moment 3 hours in when the anger settled and Thomas went very quiet. And then he said, "So Marcus knew this whole time, and he never told me." I said, "No, he didn't." Thomas was quiet a long time. Then he said something I didn't expect. He protected me. I said, "What do you mean?" "He found out who you really were, what you'd done, and he made a decision that it wasn't his story to tell. He sat on something like that for 11 years because he didn't want to blow up my relationship with my father." He shook his head slowly. "That's the most Thomas thing Marcus has ever done, and he didn't even know he was doing it for me." Thomas and Marcus talked. I don't know everything that was said. That conversation belongs to them. What I know is that Thomas called me 2 weeks later and said, "We're okay, Dad. Me and Marcus. We're okay." And then, "You need to make this right with him. Not for me, for yourself. Marcus and I have had dinner 4 times since April. His daughters call me Mr. Walter. The 12-year-old, her name is Cecelia, he named her after his mother, asked me last month if I was her grandfather. I looked at Marcus. He nodded once. I looked back at her. I said, "Yes, if you want me to be." She said, "Okay," and went back to her food. Just like that. Children. They make the hardest things look simple. He sat at my table for 32 years. He passed me the bread. He asked about my knee. He laughed at my stories. And I looked at him every single time and saw Thomas's friend. He was waiting for me to see his father's face. I never did. The DNA test saw it for me. And I have spent every day since then wondering what kind of man needs a machine to recognize his own son. Before I go, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or your country down below. I read every comment, every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think about someone in your life, subscribe. I'll be here next week with another one. Take care of yourselves.